Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into something we hear about all the time, but maybe don't fully get. Authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
That whole idea of just be yourself. So it's pretty simple, right?
It does, yeah. But looking through the sources we gathered for this research papers, articles, notes, it tells well, a much richer story. And honestly, a more challenging one, too.
Right. Seems authenticity isn't just this switch you flip. Our sources are coming at it from all these different angles, like how psychology even tries to define it.
What it actually means in our, important relationships, why it sometimes causes friction out in the world, surprisingly.
And the actual benefits, too.
Exactly, the real upsides.
So, okay, our mission here in this deep dive is really to get past the sort of easy cliche. We want to figure out what authenticity really looks like according to the experts.
Yeah, why it feels so important, but why it can be so incredibly hard sometimes.
And maybe, just maybe, pick up some pointers on how we might navigate towards it a bit more in our own lives, using this material as, like, our guide.
Sounds good. Let's maybe start by pushing back on that simple just be yourself idea first.
Okay.
Because the whole concept, it actually has this surprisingly long history. Goes way back to Aristotelian thinking, which is kind of wild.
Wow, okay.
And now today, it's become this huge societal norm, hasn't it? We're always being told we should be authentic.
Yeah, like there's this constant pressure to be real or something.
Yeah.
But the academic stuff we looked at, especially that research out of Southampton, makes a really key point.
Which is?
That researchers themselves don't even have one single definition they all agree on. They're sort of viewing authenticity through different lenses.
That's right. They've tried to pin it down in a few distinct ways. So there's one idea around self-accuracy, like having a totally unbiased, objective view of who you are, your traits.
Which sounds really difficult, maybe impossible for most of us.
Totally. And then there's self-consistency, this idea that your actions need to perfectly match up with your internal values or standards all the time.
Also sounds exhausting.
Exactly. And this is where the research gets, I think, really interesting. The sources suggest that maybe two other ideas are actually stronger predictors of whether someone feels authentic in the moment.
Okay, what are they?
So one is self-ownership. That's the feeling that you have agency, that you're in control of your actions, you're driving the bus.
Well, I think so.
And the other is self-enhancement, basically having positive feelings or perceptions about yourself.
Wait, hold on. So it's less about being perfectly accurate or consistent, and maybe more about feeling like empowered and good about yourself. That kind of goes against the usual idea of authenticity being about, showing your flaws or being brutally honest.
It does, doesn't it? The Southampton source specifically points out that people often see socially desirable behavior stuff society likes as authentic.
Huh.
And even just feeling good, having positive emotions right now, can make you feel authentic in that moment. So maybe it's less about finding some fixed, true self.
And more about feeling good and feeling like you're in charge.
Kind of, yeah. Feeling good, feeling agency. The sources also mentioned this difference between trait authenticity, like being an authentic person generally.
Versus state authenticity.
Yeah.
Feeling authentic right now.
Exactly. They're related for sure, but they're distinct experiences.
Okay, wow. That already gives us a much richer picture to start with.
Yeah.
Authenticity is complicated. It's maybe tied to feeling capable and positive.
Yeah.
So how does this actually work out in, our relationships, where it feels like it matters most sometimes?
Yeah, and this is where the Gottman material is just so valuable. They really drive home that authenticity isn't just like a nice to have in relationships. No, it's absolutely fundamental for building real connection, especially in, intimate partnerships.
And they mentioned Dr. Sue Johnson's work, right? This idea about what's often underneath arguments.
Yes, it's such a powerful lens. She basically says that a lot of the time when couples are fighting, it's actually a kind of protest.
A protest about what?
About emotional disconnection. Deep down, partners are often asking things like, are you really there for me? Can I count on you? Do I actually matter to you?
So the fight about, who takes out the trash isn't really about the trash.
Often, no. It's a bid for connection, for reassurance that they're seen, that they're valued.
That really changes how you think about conflict, doesn't it?
Completely. And they link this straight back to attachment theory, saying that healthy emotional dependence, needing someone in a good way within a secure bond, that's what actually gives us the safety.
The safety to be authentic, to take risks.
Precisely. Knowing someone has your back, that they care. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, pointed out that being able to form these close connections is a huge indicator of healthy functioning.
It's amazing how deep that need runs. I think the Gottman source had some fascinating examples, like the Hill study.
Oh, yeah. How just having a friend nearby can literally make a steep hill look less steep than when you're alone. Or the brain's studies on contact comfort.
Yeah.
It's not just, cute trivia. It shows this fundamental human need for what they call co-regulation.
Co-regulation. Okay, what exactly does that mean here?
It's basically how we rely on connection with another person, their presence, their calm, to help manage our own emotions or our nervous system.
Okay. Like borrowing their calm.
Kind of, yeah. Being with someone safe and trusted can literally calm us down, make big challenges feel smaller, help us handle tough feelings. It's a really powerful way we regulate ourselves, often much better than trying to tough it out alone.
Which loops right back to why feeling safe with someone is the absolute bedrock for showing up authentically in that relationship. You need that security.
You really do. It's the foundation.
So, okay, connection creates the safety. Safety allows the vulnerability, and vulnerability is key to authenticity. But you mentioned earlier, it's often easier said than done, even with people we love. Why is it so hard?
Well, the Gottman material digs into this too. A huge reason authenticity gets blocked is because of past experiences. Times when we did show up authentically or vulnerably.
And got burned.
Exactly. Got hurt. Maybe you shared something personal and felt rejected, or you stated a need and it was just ignored or criticized.
Yeah.
And these things, whether they happened way back in childhood, learning that certain parts of you just weren't okay with your parents or caregivers, or later on, through really painful breakups, betrayals, constant criticism, they teach you survival skills.
Like putting up walls.
Right. You learn to hide the vulnerable bits, put up guards to shield yourself from judgment or criticism or rejection or feeling abandoned again.
So the very defenses we built to protect ourselves back then become the walls that block authentic connection now.
Wow.
And it's important how they talk about trauma here. It's not always about one big, awful event. The source notes that trauma is often about our perception and the cumulative effect of things.
So smaller repeated hurts can add up, like neglect or super critical parents. Yes, or a string of really painful relationships. People get wounded in connection. And this is key, healing often happens in connection too.
That makes a lot of sense. The place of the wound is also the place of healing. And it follows that if a relationship is just full of, contempt or shame or constant harshness or betrayal,
then those protective parts, those guards, they just take over completely.
And real authenticity becomes impossible.
Pretty much impossible, because the environment just feels way too threatening to let your guard down. Which brings us right to vulnerability.
Yeah, the greater good source connects authenticity and vulnerability directly, defining vulnerability as what? The willingness to share personal stuff and take an emotional risk.
And despite how scary that feels sometimes, the research is really clear. Being vulnerable, being authentic, it pays off in relationships big time.
How so?
Well, it builds intimacy and trust.
Right.
Because you're being open. It also tends to make the other person feel safer to share too.
It's reciprocal.
Often, yeah. It fosters empathy, deeper understanding. When you share your struggles, it helps other people feel less alone with theirs, which can really reduce shame.
That example they gave about Sarah being anxious about a promotion.
Yeah, and she chose to tell her boss, Dan, instead of pretending she wasn't worried.
And he didn't see it as weakness, right? He saw it as strength, trustworthiness, and he supported her.
Exactly. It shows how vulnerability, when it lands safely, actually strengthens the connection. And the greater good source also talks about self-compassion being vital here.
How does that fit in?
Well, being kind to ourselves about our own vulnerabilities makes it easier to be kind and empathetic when others are vulnerable with us.
Right. You can't really offer what you don't have for yourself. So, okay, practical things. Acknowledging emotions instead of stuffing them down.
Asking for help shows trust, builds bonds.
Practicing that self-compassion.
Open communication, being clear about thoughts, feelings, needs.
And even, looking at people you see as authentic and getting inspired.
Yeah, seeing others be real can definitely make it feel more possible for ourselves. And circling back to relationships, Gottman really hammers home the need to actively create that emotional safety.
It's not passive.
Not at all. It means really listening, and maybe most importantly, making repair attempts after conflict, trying to fix the disconnection.
They called that the secret weapon of happy couples, didn't they?
They did. That willingness to say, okay, that went badly, let's reconnect. That commitment to safety is like the fertile soil where authenticity can actually take root and grow.
Okay, so we have a handle on what it is, why it matters in relationships, what gets in the way. But let's zoom out a bit, because the sources also talk about how authenticity can run into trouble out in the wider world.
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. That Forbes piece had a really interesting take. Maybe authenticity isn't about finding some pre-existing self.
What is it then?
Maybe it's more like we're in constant construction. So authenticity becomes less about being yourself based on old, unexamined beliefs from childhood or culture.
And more about consciously choosing, who am I choosing to be now?
Exactly. Which makes authenticity sound like really hard work, right? Because you have to question all those assumptions you just absorbed.
Definitely harder than just being yourself.
For sure. And then you layer on the perspective from that Reddit thread, which points out this huge paradox. Society claims it values authenticity, uniqueness.
But in reality, it often kind of pushes back or dislikes people who don't fit the mold, who are actually different.
Yeah. Someone in the thread called it like corporate gaslighting, being told be authentic, but then getting subtle or not so subtle, negative feedback when you actually are.
Oof. Why, though? Why the pushback?
Well, the comments suggested that real authenticity, especially if it shows vulnerability or challenges how things are normally done, can make other people uncomfortable. Maybe some people just prefer things stay on the surface.
That connects with that really powerful quote someone shared there. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
Right. It flips the script. Maybe struggling to be authentic isn't your fault. Maybe it's a healthy response to pressure to conform in ways that aren't actually healthy.
That's a deep thought. There's that tension, isn't there? We need authenticity for well-being, but we also have this deep, primal need for belonging, for attachment.
And sometimes, the sources suggest, people will actually sacrifice their authenticity just to feel accepted, to fit in.
That feels like a really painful trade-off. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sources also mentioned finding your people.
Yeah, definitely. While navigating society as a whole can be tough, finding specific individuals or groups or communities that do genuinely value realness is possible and incredibly important for support. Like those authentic relating groups mentioned on Reddit, people actively creating spaces for it.
So, okay, despite the challenges, the friction, the past hurts, the sources really bring it back around to the personal payoff, the rewards of aiming for authenticity, back to the academic stuff.
Exactly. The Southampton research, for instance, draws clear lines between authenticity and just feeling better psychologically.
Like higher self-esteem.
Yep. Higher self-esteem, greater life satisfaction overall, feeling like your basic psychological needs for connection, competence, autonomy are actually being met.
More motivation too, and resilience, bouncing back better.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to foster a sense of meaning in life, which acts like a buffer against things like anxiety, stress, even depression.
So it's not just fluffy stuff, it has real mental health implications.
Definitely. And the sources point out it goes beyond just our inner world or close relationships, too. It affects self-control, job satisfaction, even, yes, marketing. Authenticity sells, as they put it.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive. It feels like the big takeaway is that authenticity is, well, it's messy. It's way more complex than just be yourself.
Absolutely. It's got all these facets. It's deeply tied to secure relationships, requires real vulnerability and safety.
But it's constantly bumping up against societal pressures, our own old patterns, maybe even our own fears.
And it's maybe less about finding some fixed thing inside you and more about this ongoing active process, making choices, reflecting, figuring out how to navigate connection with others in the world.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Thinking about all this, the push and pull between wanting to be real and needing to fit in, where do you feel you can show up most authentically in your life right now?
Yeah, what spaces, which relationships feel the safest for that? And maybe how could you consciously try to cultivate more of those based on what we've talked about?
Definitely something to reflect on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thanks so much for exploring this with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully it gives you some new ways to think about authenticity in your own life.